This week's Torah portion is called Shelah, Lecha. And in it we read about the scouts. We read about 12 scouts who are the heads of the tribes of the Jewish people, who are sent into the land of Israel as scouts, as spies. They're going to go check out the land. What does the land look like? What does it look like physically? What do the people look like? What is the terrain? And they go into the land and they check it out, and they come back. 10 of them come back with a report that is described as evil. So the initial report is, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a beautiful land. The produce is big and lush. The grapes are huge, such that they have to be carried by 2 men and a pole in between. There's this image of the cluster of grapes being held by 2 men with a pole in between. There's such produce and such abundance in the land. And then the scouts, these 10 scouts, come back and they say, and the people who live there are giants, and we are like grasshoppers in their eyes, and we can't conquer the land. It's too scary. The giants are too big, and we are just like little people, and there's no way we're going to conquer the land, which is a fascinating report given what they have just experienced. They came out of Egypt, pursued by the Egyptians, and we understand the reed split, the Jewish people go through, and then the waters come down, back down. God drowns the Egyptian army. This massive Egyptian army is drowned by the act of God. They come through, the Jewish people come through the other end, they rejoice, it's wonderful. And then as they sojourn towards Mount Sinai, they are attacked from behind by Amalekites, another big army that's here to pick off the Jewish people from behind. They're going to attack. And again, with the help of God, the Jewish people fight off this army of Amalek. The Amalekites are defeated because God is there with the Jewish people. And so now when these 10 spies come back and they say, beautiful land, but the people are scary and we're not going to be able to conquer the land, it's fascinating because of the history that they've had where God has helped them against the Egyptian army and the army of Amalek. What's going on? So we understand many different answers are given in the commentaries, but I'd like to present 3. One is that the people knew that Moses wasn't going to go into the land of Israel with them, and they loved Moses. And so they didn't want Moses to die. If they transitioned into the land of Israel, then Moses would stay behind, and that would be the end of Moses' life. And so in order to stay longer in the desert with Moses, they gave this report because they didn't want to leave Moses behind, number one. Another answer given is that their life in the desert was filled with the presence of God. They had manna coming down from heaven. They had water coming out of a rock. They had the clouds of glory surrounding them, protecting them, keeping them safe, fending off all the adversaries of what it's like to be traveling in the desert. They had God's presence front and center. They had the Mishkan, this tabernacle with God's presence in the middle. They were so surrounded by godliness that moving into the land would be moving into a more physical reality. They would have to plant their own produce and grow the crops and make bread, and they would have to toil and work for their sustenance. It wasn't going to be handed to them on a platter. They would have to work the land and be more physical, and that they didn't want to do. They didn't want to move into a more physical reality where God would be more hidden. They loved living in the desert. And it reminds me a little bit of like the Shabbat experience. On Shabbat, we get to all the food is cooked and everything's done, and we get to sit and we get to talk and we get to be with God and we get to be with each other, and we're not running places, we're not buying things and turning lights on and watching the television. We're very in this spiritual zone and trying to connect to God. And then we transition out of Shabbat and we go into the workday where we have to work and we have to do things and we have to go places and we have to buy things and etc., etc. So we're going from a more spiritual world to a more physical world in time and space. And so too, perhaps, this is what it was like for the Jewish people. They didn't want to leave the desert where God was all around them and God was so evident and so real, and go into a more physical reality. And for that, they were fearful and they didn't want to go. So they gave this report. That's another reason given. And the third reason that I'm giving, but there are many others, is that the heads of the tribes had a vested interest in staying in the desert. In the desert, they would maintain their leadership roles. They would continue to be the leaders of the tribes. And when they moved into the land of Israel, they would lose that leadership role. So they wanted to stay in the desert because they wanted to keep their leadership roles. So here's some of the reasons given as to what it was that motivated these 10 scouts out of the 12, 10 of them, to give a report that was described as evil, such that the people believed them. These 10 scouts said, we can't go in, and the people believed them, and the people started to cry. They were crying, and they were faulted for that crying. That crying was a crying that it wasn't crying to God. It was a cry of upsettedness, but it wasn't a crying that was crying out to God. And so they believed the people, that the people believed the scouts that they couldn't go in. There were 2 scouts that came back with a different report, Joshua and Caleb. So they had techniques. Each one of them had a different technique as to how they could fortify themselves to come back and stand up against the report of the 10 that came back with the evil decree. They came back with a different decree. They came back with a decree that said, yes, we can do it. The land's beautiful. It's flowing with milk and honey, and it has lush produce. And God's with us, and we can do it. And God's promised us the land, and we can go in and we can conquer it. That was the report that Joshua and Caleb came back with. And the other scouts said, no, we can't do it. We can't do it. We can't do it. So the 2 techniques of Caleb and Yehoshua. So Caleb, before he went into the land with the other scouts, he went and took a detour, and he went to Hebron. He went to the graves of the forefathers and the foremothers. So we have an idea in Judaism of going to the graves of our holy people, of our loved ones, of our relatives, going to the graves of our foremothers and forefathers, so that in the merit of the people buried here, God should hear our prayers. That's one way of being at the kever, of the grave. Another way is that we pray that our foremothers and our forefathers should take our prayers up into the higher realms and bring our prayers up to God for us. So one is that in the merit of the people buried here, our prayers should be answered. And the other is that the people buried here, the souls buried here, should take our prayers up to God. Either way, we're praying to God. Caleb was praying to God for his role to be strengthened, for him to be able to go in and come back with this report, even though it might be antithetical to what the other scouts were giving, that he would have the strength to do that. Joshua was given a name change, and a Yud was added to his name. He was given the name Yehoshua, with Yud in the name, Yud indicating God was with him, that God was going to strengthen him, that God would be with him. And again, we have a Jewish concept that we can change our name, that when you change your name, you change your muzzle, you change your fortune, you change your trajectory, we change what will happen to us. So Joshua becomes Yehoshua with a Yud, with God in his name, that he would be strengthened, that God would be with him, that God would help him. So Joshua and Caleb come back, and they give a report that says, yes, we can do it. But the people are not listening to Joshua and Caleb. They're listening to the 10 who say, you can't do it. And they believe that they can't do it, and they cry. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about how we transition from one place of being to another. Maybe it's easier to stay where we are and not move and not transition and not take on new challenges and not go into places that are unfamiliar, that might take work, might take courage, might take faith. That transition, that moving into a new place is hard for us. And the people in the desert obviously were not ready for it. And for the 40 days that the scouts, that the spies were reconnoitering out in the land of Israel, and they came back with a report for every day that they were in the land of Israel scouting it out, the Jewish people were destined to then stay in the desert for 40 years. It was a year for a day. So for 40 days they scouted out the land. For 40 years the Jewish people had to stay in the desert, and in that time fortify themselves and grow in Emunah and become a new generation that would be able to go across the threshold from one way of being into another, to go from a spiritual domain, a very, very desert-like domain into the reality of the land of Israel, and the idea that we as the Jewish people are very linked to God, and we're very linked to the land, and that there's the three legs of the stool that is the Jewish people: God, the people, and the land. And that God will be with us, that God will help us, that God will help us conquer what we need to conquer so we can inhabit the land and live in the land and be in the land, which is our destiny to be there. So I bless us that God should give us the courage, God should give us the faith to transition to realities that might be hard for us, to make new changes, to go in the way that we're supposed to go so that we can be our best selves.